everyone for coming today. That was a great presentation from Lindsay. My name is Amber Schiltz. I'm the Wildlife Education Program Manager, and I'm also with the Fish and Wildlife Education Division. And today I'm going to be speaking about increasing ecological literacy. Original title said science communication. I changed it a little bit. So it's through education. And so my goal here today is really to be speaking about education as a conservation strategy and how we use education to really further those conservation efforts that a lot of maybe the people in this audience today are out there participating in. And I really want to break down an understanding what ecological literacy is today. Maybe some of you have heard of this term before, maybe you haven't, but we're going to define that today. There's a few different definitions we're going to look at. And then we're also going to look at the methodology that we do as wildlife educators, as science educators, in order to contribute to conservation through education. I also hope you're not sleeping, hope you're not taking this as your lunch break. I really am excited to kind of gather some input from you towards the end as well. I really like to hear from the participants here today on what ecological literacy means to you, especially as many of you are resource managers or landowners, or many of you are at least really interested in conservation efforts. So those are my goals today. All right, we're going to work through education as a conservation strategy, and then look at ecological literacy, the frameworks, challenges, and solutions that we face using this strategy, and how this strategy is going to help shape our future in conservation. So how does environmental education efforts support conservation? In 2020, there was a really fantastic analysis done by Stanford University that looked at over 100 studies that were really measuring and researching what kind of outcomes were happening through environmental education programs. And so many of us in the education field, we know the impact that we can have. We know the outcomes that we see, in the smiles and the excitement when we're leading students on hikes, or we're getting them outside and we're really helping to foster that connection. But it's really fantastic when we can see the actual scientific outcomes of these efforts, because sometimes it can be hard to measure, especially tying it directly to conservation. So what this study found was some really phenomenal takeaways, and I'll just share some of those takeaways here. One of the takeaways it found overall was that environmental education programs help to build knowledge, skills, and intentions in those participants and students, adults, to adopt environmental behaviors, which changing behavior is one of the core tenets really of conservation efforts. We have to work with people to change their behavior in order to support conservation. These programs also, they found, can increase people's pro-environmental behaviors. Often they include hands-on actions for the environment. So often when we're doing environmental education, we're not inside of a classroom, we're outside. Maybe we're even out in the habitat that conservation efforts are being put upon. And so we're actually doing the learning hands-on outside, which is really important. And it also can help build community conservation capacity. So overall, our conservation efforts are not going to work if we don't have that larger buy-in from communities, from the public, and from people who are going to be around and in that every day. And often it can even directly improve the environment. So I wanted to kind of show this to you to tie in how education really can be used as a conservation strategy. And one of the frameworks we use in the world of wildlife or science education is the overall goal. One of the overall goals we have is to increase ecological literacy. So all of these outcomes can actually work to help do that, to help increase ecological literacy among students, people, communities, and hopefully even societies. So what is ecological literacy? There's a few different kind of definitions of it. I'm sure maybe if you've heard of environmental literacy before, you might have even heard of eco-literacy. So there's a few different bodies of knowledge out there, all trying to lead towards the same concept. And I looked at the Ecological Association of America for their definition of it, because they've done a lot of really great work using national and continental stakeholders to try to define what this is. And the reason we like to define what it is because then we have a framework and a structure to understand where can we go, and it'll help influence what kind of goals and outcomes we have as educators. So I'm sure many of you have heard of science literacy before. That's the more general, broad, being able to understand the knowledge and understanding of scientific concepts at large, and really those scientific and concepts that actually influence us every single day. So a scientific literate person is able to make personal decisions and participate in civic and cultural affairs. Ecological literacy is kind of a subset of that underneath scientific literacy. So there's a lot of parallels, but it's more about that region and that place and that understanding of where you are. And especially it's an understanding of the ecological and cultural interactions in terms of human dependence and integration within those systems. So not only understanding that everything that we do as humans depends on the larger natural resource system, but also things that we do can have an impact on those systems. The definition of ecological literacy kind of comes down to two main cores of thinking. One is the core ecological concepts. So what are those specific concepts that people might need to understand in order to be ecologically literate? And also it's more of the processes or the way of thinking. So I'm going to speak to both of those today. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention also the fact that the concept of ecological literacy is not a new one. The term might be more new, but there's been many different cultures and peoples over the last hundreds of thousands of years where it was part of their cultural value to have that ecological literacy and that connection and understanding to the land. So if you haven't heard of traditional ecological knowledge, this is that body of knowledge that looks at, the accumulated body of evolving knowledge and practice acquired by indigenous and local peoples over hundreds of thousands of years through direct contact with environment. So this is something that I'm seeing pop up more and more as we're talking about environmental education, as we're talking about ways to reach out and connect with diverse audiences. And we're understanding how important it is to bring other voices to the table that maybe have not been there before. And so if you're interested in learning more about traditional ecological knowledge, it's really it's a fascinating and really important concept. I think it's important as resource managers and also as educators. This is a definition that I got from Fish and Wildlife Education, or Fish and Wildlife Service, and I can share this link in the chat later. So traditional ecological knowledge, it's also specific to that location. It includes relationship between each of those plants, animals, and natural phenomena. It includes knowledge of the connection from humans on the landscape as well, so management practices such as hunting, fishing, trapping, and agriculture. And it's also passed down through these adaptive processes through cultural transmission. So I talk about this and I talk about the other definitions to just kind of put out there that there's a few different definitions of what ecological literacy is and how can we use that to continue our education efforts. It's really a lot about that systematic way of thinking as well. And so it's thinking about the connectedness and the integration between our personal systems, our societal systems, such as our economy, and the greater ecological systems that we all have a foundational, need in survival that we all depend on. It's also thinking about the ecological science, so the actual science that goes into understanding how we know about natural resources here in Nebraska. And to be ecologically literate, it's helpful if you have a really good familiar of understanding models, you have an understanding of scientific uncertainty, issues of scale. This is the most parallel to just scientific literacy at large, just understanding the limitations of science and how we communicate the data and the results that we find. And I think what's most important about understanding what ecological literacy is and increasing it among people in Nebraska is because it's really helpful for people to have that understanding of your place in the world and that connection to their local ecological space. And so a lot of times what we talk about in our education division is that we can go in and speak to students, and often I'll ask them, what's your favorite Nebraska animal? And the answers I get are really interesting, are really telling, because often I get tiger and I get bear, and I swear, I promise you, I've heard shark several times. And so these kiddos are excited about animals, and that's great, and they're excited about wildlife, and that's great. But to understand that they're not familiar with the amazing natural resources and phenomena and wildlife we find right here in Nebraska, that's what we're trying to strive towards. It's incredibly important to learn about the rainforest. It's incredibly important to learn about the oceans and the greater systems that involve, the whole globe. But it's also equally, if not more important, to understand and connect to that local space that they have. And that's what we're trying to do with these strategies. Monica, I'm kind of going through here really fast, so if there's any questions, please let me know.
Will do.
I really enjoyed this quote. It speaks to ecological literacy. Children are born with a sense of wonder and affinity for nature. Properly cultivated, these values can mature into ecological literacy and eventually into sustainable patterns of living. I went through kind of like the big picture stuff of what this is, why it's important to conservation. And now what I want to do is kind of lift the veil a little bit on some of the methodologies that we use as educators to make sure that we are striving to meet this goal. And I say this with the goal of understanding the challenges that we have, understanding the challenges that teachers across Nebraska have in linking what they're teaching in science to the ecology happening here in Nebraska. But also for anyone in the audience who might be a resource manager, a landowner, or anyone who's enthusiastic about conservation, you know, these types of things can be learned from and borrowed in other practices that we're doing to engage people in conservation. Okay, so do not be intimidated. This is a lot of text and I understand that. What I wanted to show you is I want to show you the 7 core concepts that the Ecological Association of America has put together that's really critical and important in the concept of ecological literacy. So those 7 concepts are right here on the left. It's biological diversity, understanding species and habitat interactions, understanding populations, understanding matter and energy in ecosystems, interactions within ecosystems, ecosystem impacts on human health and well-being, so how we're impacted and how we depend on natural systems, and also the impacts that humans have then on ecosystems themselves, so that kind of feedback loop. And so the reason I show this chart right here is I want to kind of, like I said, lift the veil on what we try to do as educators and how we try to achieve those goals in using education for conservation. So I'm going to walk through just 2 examples of how we might do this to teach to some of these core concepts. So for example, the first core concept, biological diversity. How are we going to be able to frame this? By using Nebraska ecology. That's the goal. So the core concept of biodiversity, a learning goal might be for this, what is biodiversity at the species level within an area or a biome? So one way that we might be able to do this, instead of you know, speaking about rainforests in South America or speaking about the phenomenal like the deserts in Australia, how can we frame this through the Nebraska lens? So here is kind of an example of something that we might do to make sure we're meeting this outcome. We could conduct a biological inventory or a bioblitz. If you've not heard of a bioblitz, maybe we'll hear about it a little later, but it's a really exciting, engaging way to get students and participants and the general public in doing a biological inventory of an area. So what bugs are they finding? What birds are they finding? What plants, what animals are they finding in a space? So they could do that, and they might even be able to compare, say, an urban park bioblitz, biological inventory, with a prairie. And so then you start to have these phenomenal discussions and reflections of, you know, why are we finding maybe more insects in this prairie versus the urban park? What kind of needs do they have for habitat? And so that is a way, you know, kind of going backwards of how we can help teach about biodiversity through the Nebraska lens. One more example just to show you and walk you through. If we're trying to speak about species and habitat interactions, and for example, our learning goal is how do species interact with their habitat? One lens that we can use through the Nebraska lens is, for example, we could maybe compare and contrast a species that occupies a really broad range throughout Nebraska, and then compare it to a species that might have a more narrow or isolated range. And then we start to get these discussions and these reflections. What are the different interactions? Why, for example, would a white-tailed deer be found throughout most of the state, but the pronghorn only found in western Nebraska? Or same with fox squirrel versus kangaroo rats. Just to kind of show you some examples of how we use these kind of frameworks to promote ecological literacy. I'm going to stop for a second because I do see some questions. Are there any questions I can ask or I can answer right now, Monica?
We don't have any questions. We're just kind of having some good discussions about wildlife.
Neat. I love it. Okay. Keep that up. I won't bother you with that. Okay. So I spoke a bit about what ecological literacy is. I spoke a little bit about some of the methods that we use and some of the things that we think as educators in increasing that. And there are some challenges, but also there's hopefully a lot of solutions as well. And so I want to talk about how is science taught in Nebraska? Because a lot of what I just mentioned are things that we think about when we put on programs or we write curriculum. And when I say we, I'm talking about more of the informal educators who are teaching wildlife and nature and science. But that's not the majority of how, that's not where students are spending most of their time, 40 hours a week, right? They're in school. So how is science being taught in Nebraska? The cool, exciting thing is that we did get a recent update in our Nebraska State Science Standards that have really tried to focus on exactly what I'm speaking about. They're trying to connect a lot of those opportunities to teach about science right here in Nebraska. And so they do focus on these cross-cutting concepts of science and engineering. They're more phenomena-based. It's less memorizing things and more like thinking critically about different phenomena and how you can apply it in different ways. And so it's really a step in the right direction. And so every single teacher in Nebraska will have this standard booklet. And whenever there's that symbol of that heron, that is signaling that there's an opportunity to use this science lesson and teach about Nebraska, something happening in Nebraska. And so educators are encouraged to draw upon those Nebraska natural resources in the environment that we have here in order to support that studying and that standard. The problem is these are fairly new standards, and so they've been kind of scaffolded into our public education at large over the last few years. The problem is often teachers understand that, hey, this is an opportunity to go and use a Nebraska-focused topic, but they're not sure where to go, or they don't know where those resources are. So I threw up a few examples here. I just grabbed some standards. I'll just look at the bottom one. It says, develop a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers in the environment. So that's the tools and resources that a teacher might have. And of course, they also have curriculum that they use. But with that symbol there that says, hey, you can talk about Nebraska here. You don't have to only speak to global ecosystems here. It's there and it's helpful, but what we've learned is that they don't have any supplementary kind of guides that says, hey, here's how you can connect this to Nebraska in this specific way. And so that is something that's kind of a challenge, but it's also an opportunity for us as the Nebraska Parks Commission and other conservation organizations within the state. It's an opportunity for us to reach out and kind of bridge that divide and help meet those needs and be that resource. You know, we have that understanding of what's happening in Nebraska, ecologically speaking. We understand about conservation efforts, we understand about research taking place. So how can we help teachers, you know, how can we supplement that and give them resources to get Nebraska ecology right there in the science classroom? And that's one of the, this slide, it's because we have such a rich, a state full of rich natural resources and ecological phenomena. We have all these amazing things happening. And so at some point, it's just this matter of communicating and engaging and, like I said, bridging that gap between the education that's taking place and the phenomenal science and research and natural resources that we have in the state. And that is a huge goal of what our division, Fish and Wildlife Education Division, does. It's a lot of what we do is we try to provide, we bridge that gap. We try to provide that science-based programming, you know, Nebraska focused. We put on a lot of teacher workshops. We do a lot to work with the public education system in order to help bridge that divide and communicate what's going on in our state and how they can use that in their programs. Okay, I do feel like I'm going really fast. 20 minutes is a really short amount of time, so I'm doing my best. But
you're at 1:20 right now, Amber, just a heads up.
What'd you say?
You got 10 minutes, Amber.
Okay, sweet. So shaping our future. So obviously we understand, probably most of us here participating in this conference understand the importance of ecological literacy. I would probably be just preaching to the crowd if I went on about this. We understand it's necessary for understanding our natural world. It's instrumental for people to help make informed decisions and allows them to really understand the connections between themselves and the world around them in our state here. And so it's very, very important, but specifically to conservation, which is where a lot of you might come in. Just telling the story of Nebraska conservation, your work as resource managers, as conservation stewards, as volunteers, as landowners, as biologists, your work, your passions, and your science, it's an incredibly valuable resource to our state. And it can be used as a tool in the effort to increase ecological literacy across Nebraska. And conservation efforts, I mean, everybody knows this, they need public support. And so what we really focus on within our division often is the younger crowd. But young students today are going to be tomorrow's future consumers. They're going to be the future decision makers, policy voters, landowners, and hopefully future stewards of our state's natural resources. So it's really important that we reach them in these efforts to increase ecological literacy. So working to increase ecological literacy in Nebraskans today will hopefully result in better conservation success tomorrow. And that's kind of what I want to leave you with that thought.